I'll moderate the session on behalf of product people. So I'll be briefly talk about the agenda today. So initially, I'll start with an introduction to product people. Then we'll have a presentation followed by a Q&A session and the networking event at the end. So about product people, we are a German-based product management consultancy, and we help communities and companies efficiently discover and deliver great products faster. So how we do this is we do this by filling temporary product management needs in our client's organization as interim PMs. We also help clients to quickly obtain high product profitability by offering product management consulting services. And we also support companies by providing product management training. We are also a product community builder, and we invite people and different product leaders to share their knowledge and experience around product management. So today we are glad to welcome Megan, Product Manager, Microsoft Azure IoT Mobility, and she'll be sharing with us knowledge about transitioning to product management for non-tech folk. So thank you, Megan, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. I'll now stop sharing the screen and you can then start the presentation.
Cool. I will share my screen then. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep. Okay.
So like Utkarsh said, my name is Megan. I am a product manager currently working in Azure IoT Mobility. I work specifically on our connected vehicle platform. But prior to that, I actually was a business major in my university. I studied finance and information systems, and I actually started my career in corporate finance, which is not how a lot of people in product start their careers. So over a couple of years, I made the switch over into product. And so I spend a lot of time either mentoring or talking to people about how I made the switch, and hopefully offering a couple tips and tricks for all of you looking to make the switch as well. So I'll kind of start by talking a little bit about my experience, why I think you are probably qualified. That is one of the first questions I get. And then kind of go through some steps that I think are helpful in kind of making this transition more successfully. See if my screen wants to change. There we go. So the first thing I really noticed when I was kind of going through this process is that there's a huge discrepancy, I think specifically in tech companies, about who gets hired as PMs and what PMs actually do. So a lot of my friends who took product management roles right out of university, they studied computer science, they were probably part of the product club at their university, they had kind of experience interning at really large tech companies, and got hired right away, and the path was super straightforward. But what I found kind of interesting is when I started to look into like, what do product managers actually do? When I was kind of initially considering the switch from corporate finance, that's a super highly interdisciplinary role. And probably a lot of you who are already looking to make that switch have realized that as well, right? Product managers do everything from talk with marketing and design and pricing and launching strategies and sales, and they help architect solutions, and they really do a whole bunch of different things. A lot of those core competencies have to do with problem solving, leadership, strategic thinking, communication, having focus on customers. And so I think what kind of I started to realize is that there's many, many different ways and many different backgrounds that people can have that lead them to be really good at kind of those core competencies, which are shown kind of in the middle of the screen here. And so it kind of made me wonder, like, why are so many of the product managers I meet have one type of background if PMs really are responsible for leading and driving change across all of these different areas that go into creating and developing products. So that was kind of the mindset that started and made me wonder, like, why is this so difficult? And I kind of used that frame of reference, I think, to think about how I was going to make this switch. So one of the very first things that happened to me when I started applying to PM roles is that I saw a ton of rejection. And some of you may be there as well. A couple of things that I were told right away is that, like, you don't have a computer science degree. There's no way you could do product, especially being at Microsoft. A lot of our product roles are very technical product roles. I didn't have any, specific extracurriculars based in product. A lot of my work experience was in finance. And so kind of right off the bat, there was no one who was like, oh, yes, we see potential. And so one of the first things I really took upon myself was to demonstrate that potential. I think someone on the call already mentioned this when we were kind of talking before the recording about like, how do you frame that experience in a way that shows that you have the right mindset and the right capabilities to kind of be a product manager. And so a couple of the things that I did here was to really frame my experience. So I talked about, I connected things like finance, worked a lot with data. Data is core to product, how that made me really obsessed with using data to make good product experiences, and connected that also with kind of looking at some of the work that I had done and seeing where there was overlap with product management. So in my resume, reframing the things that I had already done in a way that aligned with how product managers do things. So, I was responsible for developing a solution, whether that solution was, a financial model or a full product. I still developed a solution and went through that process of thinking through the end user and the inputs and how people were going to use this. And all of those things are really translatable across disciplines, wherever you're starting from, to end up in product. And so that to me was a key piece in kind of creating and crafting my own story about why I was qualified for this role. The next thing I want to talk about is how you translate that into yourself. So there's a couple kind of steps I'll go through, and this is kind of what I talked about what I did in my resume, but making it a little more tactical. So starting by identifying why, evaluating your own experience, being able to tell a really crisp and clear story about yourself, learning from rejection, and then trying again and again. So we kind of start with this identify why. This is when I mentor people, one of the very first things that I always talk about. One of the very first things I found I was asked when I was either doing informationals or interviews for different product roles was the first question was, well, why do you want to be a product manager? And I didn't really think much about this question initially. I think product is, especially in the tech world, is a very kind of hot area to be into. But people in that field already know that the job itself is much more complicated and much more difficult sometimes than it seems on paper. It can seem glamorous, but be very unglamorous at the same time. And so having a really good idea of like why I actually wanted to do this and being unique and thoughtful about that, I think is really beneficial. To kind of come up with that why for yourself, a couple things I'd recommend doing. First of all, make sure you're setting up one-on-ones with PMs. One of the biggest things I think that was helpful was talking to my friends who were already product managers or other kind of connections that I had who were working in product already. I think really learning about their day-to-day experience, what were the struggles, what were the challenges, how did they solve those, helped me understand and articulate a bit more clearly why I think I would be good at it and why I also wanted to do it. The other thing was to send emails to people. I think it's also really important to talk to people outside of your natural network. So Victoria and I actually met on Lunch Club. And so, whether it's sending cold emails or being involved with other kind of product meetup circles, being able to talk to PMs who are outside of your kind of day-to-day purview gives you kind of outside perspectives and other kind of understanding of why people are interested in product. The other thing is to make connections. I think one of the biggest things when making that switch and figuring out why is talking to people in the industry. Product managers are generally very well connected, either to other PMs at their company or other companies as they move around. It can be a small community sometimes. And so being part of that and driving those connections home is really beneficial as well. The last thing is to ask why. I think one of the things that really helps demonstrate good product skills is the ability to ask really, really good questions. So when you're going through these kind of 3 steps I said earlier, of meeting with other people, reaching out, trying to make connections in this industry, make sure that when you are asking those questions and learning about people's experiences, that you double click down on why they're doing things, why they feel that way, why they think that way about certain aspects, because that not only demonstrates to other PMs, whether you're interviewing with them or doing informationals with them, that you have the right mindset, but it also helps you understand a little bit more crisply what the day-to-day functions of the role is and how you can make those own connections between things that you've done and things that you will do as a PM. And I think that is super important in this next step here as well, which is to evaluate your own experiences. So one of the things I tell people right away, people a lot of times I think are really hyper-focused on the job title that they have or have done before. Like, oh, I'm a project manager, not a product manager, or it's a program manager, not a product manager, or for me, I was a finance manager, not a product manager. But when you evaluate your experience, really look at what you actually did. So think about, what am I doing in my day-to-day job? I'm not just making, in my case, like financial models. I'm actually looking at like all of Microsoft's customers, and I'm looking at how, their revenue patterns and those trends impact what we're selling. And so I can then translate that into understanding how I'm going to create, a better user experience or think about delivering something. And so being able to kind of understand and connect whatever your current experience is to what you could do outside of the day-to-day kind of assumptions that come with your typical job title, I think can be super beneficial in kind of better evaluating what your current experience is. I think a lot of people have really relatable experience, but it's sometimes disguised in kind of the lingo of whatever field you're currently in. So it's important to kind of remove that lens and see if you can find and apply a different lens that is more product focused to be able to talk about it. The other thing is to kind of find and identify your story. So while you're kind of talking to people, while you're rethinking what you do, think about why you started in the place that you did and why you want to end up in product. And think about all the things that you've done in between that you think really are good experiences that you can leverage. One of the things people always tell me now when I'm interviewing for PM roles that I have kind of started in a different place than a lot of PMs and ended up in product is that, oh, we love that you have such a unique background. That's so interesting. You offer such fresh perspectives. So I think that having that different background, while it makes it more difficult to get into product, is viewed very favorably while you're in product. But oftentimes making that first switch into it is super difficult. And so I would encourage you when you're kind of like thinking about your story and how you tell that in your interviews or your informationals, is that you have already articulated a way of like why your unique background is super beneficial to the kind of sort of product manager that you will be. It's important to keep in mind too, like PMs do so many different types of things, and there's a lot of different styles of PMs that people have. And so you can bring your own unique and fresh perspective. And I think a lot of times, like taking that first PM role is about finding an opportunity where they need a product manager who may have the skill sets that you bring from other roles. And so being really crisp and clear about that in your story, I think can make you a really, really unique and valuable candidate to a team, even if you don't have the typical experience that they're looking for. So be really crisp and really clear about that as well. There's more clicks. So for me, when I was doing this, that was kind of talking about my current job. I spent a lot of time rebranding my resume. I'll talk to this in a moment, but creating a portfolio was super beneficial to me, and then ultimately using that to land my first PM role. So this is kind of one of the last things I'll bring up here before we go into Q&A. But one of the things that really helped me, I talk a lot about, thinking through your experience and really kind of rebranding that. One of the most beneficial ways for me to do that, I'm a very visual, very kind of tactile learner, was actually making a portfolio and outlining some of the experiences into a way that translated to what a product manager did. So I thought about, for instance, like one of the sort of like financial models that I built, and I was like, okay, what is the problem I was trying to solve with this? Who were my customers? Who were the teammates I worked with, and what role did I play in that team? Then how did I think about solving and breaking down this problem? How did I actually solve the problem? What challenges did I face in solving the problem, and what would I do differently next time? And so I think taking that framework and applying it to literally anything that you've done and any kind of background that you have, those are common steps in solving a problem. And really good product managers are ultimately problem solvers across the industry. And so if you can demonstrate that more visually, if you're having a hard time kind of rebranding and talking about your experience, I think something like this can be a really good strategy to communicate early on about how your experience is so directly related to what you want to do. And so this is something that it definitely takes more time than a resume, but I think if you're really serious about making the change, can be super beneficial to really articulating that. And I found a lot of success with my portfolio as well. So both in getting my current, my first product role, as well as now my second one too. So the last thing too here, learn from rejection. It's going to be super normal to be discouraged in this process. I think it took me almost a year from when I decided I wanted to be a PM into actually landing my first role. And so one of the things I think that's really beneficial is to learn from all the rejection and all the conversations that you have. Take the feedback that's important, pass on the feedback that isn't, but make sure you're politely asking from all of your interviews or informationals what kind of feedback you have. I think that was super beneficial to me in understanding how people were perceiving the story that I was telling. And from there, I was able to kind of make small tweaks to how I was telling that story and how I was communicating things. That is also a very good, I would say, core kind of PM skill to get in the habit of. Communication is a really, really big part of this job. And so kind of demonstrating that early on in the process and getting in the mindset of doing that, not only is it a good way to demonstrate that's kind of the person that you want to be in as a PM, but also kind of help you continue to refine your story as you go on. So make sure to keep trying again and again. It is a hard thing to do, but I truly believe that some of the best product managers I've worked with in the industry so far come from really non-traditional backgrounds, and that some of the best product teams have people from all different kind of experiences. And so I really hope to see more people from various backgrounds get into the industry. I think we're at a really interesting point where, especially with technology, it's starting to intersect with so many other sectors. So there's a lot of opportunities for people who come from some of those more non-traditional backgrounds to make a huge difference in how we're thinking about redefining products in this area. So I encourage you to not give up and keep trying, and hopefully kind of put some of these tips and tricks in place. So that is all I have. You feel free to connect with me or ask more questions on LinkedIn. I'm fairly responsive there, or on Twitter too. And so now I'll pass it back to you guys, the product people, for questions.
Thank you, Megan, for such an insightful presentation and also relatable content, how we need to create story and while we transition into product management. So thanks a lot. So we are now open to Q&A and everyone is welcome to ask questions. So those who are joining from YouTube or Facebook, your questions will be transferred here. And those who are joining on Zoom, you can put your questions on chat, or you are welcome to ask verbally the questions. So right now we already have a question on YouTube from Brian. So the question is, as a PM for a larger organization like Microsoft, are there any unique challenges you have seen in bringing new products to such a large audience as opposed to some smaller organizations?
Yeah, I mean, scale factor definitely has a huge thing to do with it. So I think at a big company, one of the things that's very unique is that when we plan for product launches, we have to assume things happen at scale and at mass, which means things like our quality reviews, our privacy reviews, how we plan for capacity and everything like that on the back end is super important to going into rolling out and launching a product. We have to assume that kind of some of the biggest customers in the world will be onboarding and using these things. The other thing, and I think I mentioned this, but communication is a huge part of the product management role. And I think specifically when you work in super large companies, that is even more important. Like when we do roadmap planning, we're not just looking at like our individual team, but we're trying to coordinate asks across, all of Azure, which is a very large org in of itself, and then across all of Microsoft. Microsoft runs on Azure as well. And so doing that, I think, it requires a certain degree of patience and a lot of time spent doing all of those things. And so the scale factor is difficult, but I think being able to kind of very crisply and communicatively translate those asks across teams and across the company as a huge, huge skill set that is definitely valued. I think more so than anything, some of the most successful PMs I've seen at Microsoft are the ones who've been really great at kind of leveraging that skill.
Okay, thank you. I hope this answered Brian's question. So we have another question from Kate. And first of all, she's thanking you for sharing the experience. And the question is, now that you have made it as a PM, do you find that you face unique challenges as a non-tech person? And if so, how do you navigate it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something I actually forgot to bring up here. One of the things I really don't like actually is when people, especially when they're like interviewing or trying to make the transition, is they tell me that they're not technical. Because being like not technical to me is a frame of mind more so than an actual capability. I think to be a product manager at a tech company, you need to learn, you need to understand and be able to learn technical things. That does not mean that you have to have a computer science background to be technical. I think that's a big misunderstanding. Like before, 20, 30 years ago, when this was happening, a lot of people who were PMs or history majors or English majors, like having that degree did not necessarily mean you were or weren't technical. And so I would say that, yes, like in the beginning, I probably had to work more on ramping up on learning some of the technical components. But I never felt that I could never learn those things. And so I think, especially when we talk about mindset, that's something that's really important. I would never identify yourself as a quote unquote not technical person. I would say, like, rephrase it as like, I can learn anything technical, and you should be able to learn technical things. You're going to work really closely with engineers and need to influence how they're designing things. So certainly I had to work harder on learning that part of it. It wasn't my most natural skill set, but I would not say that that has hindered me from being successful as a PM. It's just like everyone has certain strengths and weaknesses. And when you're in a really interdisciplinary role, you should always expect that you're going to have to lean on some strengths and lean on some weaknesses as well. So something I definitely had to work more on, but definitely should not be a hindrance in being a good product manager.
Yeah, that's very relatable. So I see another question from Meetup AI Global account, and the question is, could you share some of the feedback you got that you didn't find useful and felt best to forget about it?
That's a good question. I think there was just some people I met with who were kind of like, you'll never be qualified unless you go back to school, or we recommend that you have to do, this computer science class or this or that. And I never felt that was what was holding me back. It was really like the mindset of certain individuals. I should be clear, like there's always going to be people in this industry, just like any other job, who are really biased to like one set of experiences. That's like normal human bias. Those were the kind of people that I kind of frankly felt like were not necessarily people I wanted to work for anyways. And that's like an important piece of this, is working for people who you want to work for, especially in a job like product where it's very influence heavy. So those are the kind of people that I was like, thank you for that, but I'm going to pass on that. Like, I don't think that's actually what's holding me back here. And I still feel like I'm really qualified to do this, and that I have good ideas and I have relevant kind of experience. So those are the kind of things that like I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to do. I'd considered going to school. I'd considered some of those things, but a lot of the courses that I was looking at, I felt like was kind of a repeat of things that I'd done in various kind of university classes already. So that was advice that like didn't seem to land well. And ultimately ended up not being important when I found other teams that really liked my experience. And again, were looking for people who had kind of more of those different backgrounds. It was much more successful. So if, there's people that don't tell you have to do X, Y, Z, if you don't feel like that matches like what your weaknesses are necessarily, don't feel like you have to listen to that necessarily. It's always important to hear feedback. It's also important to filter feedback.
Yeah, thank you for such a great explanation to this question. So we have another question, and two questions are almost related, but yeah, I'll go through them. So Henrik asks, how did you manage to understand the tech part of the job, like coding, without actually having studied in that field? And especially in job interviews, don't you have to prove a general understanding?
Yeah, so I would say and I'll start with that one. In job interviews, like the book that's like the most classic PM book ever is Cracking the PM Interview. If you've ever read that, you'll actually like learn that they're not going to generally ask you coding questions in product management roles and product management interviews. And if they're looking for a PM who's going to code, that might not be the right PM role. That's generally not what product managers do. And that might not be the PM role you want to be in either. That's finding fit, very important again. But that book really talks about kind of the frameworks and understanding how PMs solve problems and using those frameworks to dissect different problems. I found that to be super true in all of the product interviews I've done. Everything they're asking me about is how did I solve problems, whether that was a business problem or a technical problem. But it's important to understand solving a technical problem doesn't necessarily mean coding. Sometimes that means like communicating with the right people, bringing in the right people to answer the questions, like being the person who probes just the right amount to figure out the true motivations. And so that is something that I would say doesn't inherently require coding, but is again more about problem solving at large. Specifically, how did I kind of like learn to understand this? I did take a couple different like computer science classes, like they weren't part of my major at all in college. So I had some background there. And I would say if you are looking to be in a technical product management role and you generally have no idea about kind of like 3-tier architecture or things like that of that nature, I would spend time, there's tons of like little programs online that's like, here's how to code in, 10 to 15 minutes, or here's YouTube series. Like I would spend time reading and educating yourself on some of those things. It's important to kind of know some of the terminology and the jargon. I would never like put myself up to code something. I don't think that's like necessarily a strong skill of mine. But it is important to understand how those processes work. But that's no different than like any product thing, right? You need to understand a bit of the domain that you're working in, but that just might be something that you need to spend some time educating and researching a little bit more. But that doesn't inherently require like a formal education. Tech started with a ton of people who just had informal educations, right? All of that is available to you freely on the internet. So, making sure to invest time in those things as well.
Yeah, great. So another question is related to, like you mentioned, that we don't have to be proficient. So Andres asked that how deep was your knowledge in topics like coding or UX, and how proficient you need to get before you get the first job or first role?
Yeah, so I would say how proficient is like a hard question to answer. A lot of that's going to depend on like the level you are in career, the type of PM role. Again, like I was entering like at a fairly early on in my career. I was only 2 or 3 years out of college, so I was like taking more junior product roles. In general, I would say I would measure your kind of success in those things more in your aptitude than your specific proficiency at that point in time. Like I had a very big, I spent the first couple months of my product management role, like spending a lot of time just like reading and writing and asking questions and getting, having people on my new team like mentor me and like really break down different technical topics. So I certainly wasn't like, I started in Azure networking. I was certainly not proficient in cloud networking before I started that role, but I think I had a lot of aptitude to understand technical topics, break down those problems that they were solving, and kind of contribute to some of those broader conversations from a more strategy and business perspective. So again, I think like I was hired in that role for the aptitude to do those things rather than the specific proficiency. And I think a lot of product roles are actually looking for that. They're looking for people who will come in, learn the domain, and bring a fresh perspective, not necessarily be experts in that area. That changes a little bit more if you're more senior in your career, you're trying to take more senior product management level roles, then they're looking for a bit more of that experience. But especially if you're looking for kind of more early in career, they definitely tend to be hiring more for aptitude of that domain than the specific kind of proficiency.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I hope this answered the question. So we have a lot of questions on YouTube and on Zoom chat asking about different resources. So if you would recommend any book or online course. And yeah, there's one question specifically about UX or Python, if you recommend any course on that.
Got it. Okay, so big resources for me, I would say in the product mindset, Cracking the PM Interview, that's like a classic. Everyone should read it. It's super helpful, especially making the transition. Stratechery is a blog that's written by I think he's an ex-Microsoft, ex-Google, maybe also ex-Apple product manager, but he does a lot of interesting kind of like every day there's a new article about different kind of trends and things happening across industry, and it's very kind of multidisciplinary. That's a great one to read. You kind of start formulating your own opinions about product and growth and things like that. In terms of like UX and Python, I did not have any specific Python courses, so I can't recommend anything there. On UX, I would say there's a lot of interesting classes around design thinking. IDEO has some really interesting ones. I've taken a few of theirs just as the time has gone on. And they have really interesting ones about how to kind of incorporate design thinking into both kind of like user interfaces as well as kind of just like the general service design or problem solving process. So those are kind of good things to look at, I would say. Honestly, if you're looking to like learn a very specific subset of like UX or Python, like YouTube is amazing. I would say like I spent before, like it depends on the role you're interviewing for, right? Like I was doing a lot of ones focused on cloud. And so like I spent a lot of time watching like, what does cloud networking mean? How does it work before those interviews? So like whatever that specific domain is, spend time researching that so you can kind of start to formulate an opinion. It's also good to research the competitors in an area. I work for Azure. I was interviewing for Azure. I spent a lot of time looking at what AWS and Google were doing in those areas. Those are kind of important things to know before going into an interview that you can kind of learn from without having necessarily a specific kind of like industry beholden domain knowledge there.
Okay, great. So I'll now switch to questions from Zoom. Hitain has asked, how do we get contacts for cold emailing to send our work?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we get contacts for cold emailing to send our work? I'm not sure if Hitain would like to verbally also ask this.
Yeah, hi Megan, this is Hitain. In one of your decks, you mentioned about cold emailing. Could you please elaborate how we can approach people?
Got it. Yeah. So strategically, yes, I would definitely recommend like spend time being thoughtful if you're doing cold emails or like generally people use, I think, LinkedIn for this nowadays, about who you're connecting to. I would say like one of the best pieces of advice I would say is if you can find a friend of a friend or a person of a person that you kind of have some general connection with who could connect you more directly with that person, that's always the best bet. If you can make some sort of personal introduction or some sort of personal connection to that person, that is really beneficial. I would also say I have done kind of like one-off meetings with people who just reach out to me on LinkedIn. And I would say one of the things I really appreciate and that I'm more willing to take time for certain people is when they have very specific questions that they'd like answered. And they're generally like very prompt about like setting up the meeting itself and coming prepared, you know, like, hey, here's 15 minutes. I have kind of these 2 or 3 questions that are related to what I think your experience is. Can I, you know, connect with you? Are you the right person to talk to about this? Or do you have someone else to recommend to speak with? Sometimes I think that's a good way of making sure that you're connecting with the right person. If you're a little too broad or like, sometimes I get kind of emails that are just like, hey, I'm looking to transition into product. Like, what did you do? Like, that's a little too vague, I think, to like make me feel like the time is going to be productive. And so if you can kind of be specific about, hey, I see you're a product manager in this type of industry. I'm interested in this industry. I have this background. Do you mind spending 15 minutes talking with me about that? Definitely more likely, I think, to gain traction in that way. But again, I would say first and foremost, if you can find a friend of a friend, a connection of a connection to kind of connect you with some of those people and kind of, expand the breadths of your own natural network, that is generally the most successful, I think, way to go about it.
Yeah, thanks, Megan.
Okay, so there are some comments on the non-tech part. So Kate mentions that as a PM with 2 degrees in art history, I agree with you. And another comment from Clyde. So he says, I studied philosophy and then law and ended up as PM. So it's definitely doable.
Yes. Yeah. Like I said, there's so many people that come from different backgrounds. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things about working in this industry too.
And yeah, so next question is from Natalia about if you recommend any PM certifications.
So I have heard people have great success at them. I have never done one personally myself. But I feel like if that is kind of the way that you learn best and you like that more structured format, there's definitely some great ones. I know the Product School offers some specific courses. They also have a lot of free webinars. Those are I think great avenues to explore. It really depends, I think, on, kind of if you know no one in product and don't really have, you feel like an avenue to kind of gain traction there, that might be a good avenue to explore. Or if you're someone who really prefers more structured kind of focused learning, I think a lot of those programs offer that, and that's also super beneficial too. Personally, I'm a bit more unstructured in some of those ways, and online classes are generally very difficult for me to be focused on. So I didn't think that was going to be my most successful avenue, but I know a lot of people who've had great success with them as well. So.
Great, thank you. So I see 2 questions from Augustine. If you'd want to ask the questions here on Zoom verbally. Okay, then I'll ask. Okay, so thank you for sharing your experience. Coming from a non-traditional background, how do you manage to influence decisions and lead your team of engineers and designers?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think when you it's important to understand the kind of the clear delineation of like product managers and engineering leads need to work super closely together. And so I think it's important to kind of understand how the product manager works with those people, in the sense of there's core architecture decisions that I'm going to lean very heavily on those engineering experts to come up with. But my job as a product manager is to kind of keep asking why we're making that decision and what the trade-offs or benefits of those decisions being made are. In terms of wanting to change that decision or influence it a different way, I think the biggest thing to communicate is the all-up kind of business and product strategy that you're trying to achieve. And so whether that is, high growth, or whether it's super important to meet a certain date for a customer, or, you really need to be targeting this kind of specific sector or this type of customer with the initial version of the product, being able to understand what the bigger picture is and what the end goal that you're trying to achieve is, and then being able to break that down and translate it for your engineers, I think really helps them not only make the right architecture and design decisions, but helps you achieve what you're trying to achieve at a more Uber level as well. So I think those kind of core skills of both asking why, probing, knowing when and where to ask the questions about the design decisions being made, and then also translate that back into the all-up strategy you're trying to drive, it's super important. I think one of the things I learned kind of early on is that product managers really have access more than anyone else on the team generally to the all-up kind of goals and strategies that the team is trying to drive. Sometimes your day-to-day engineers or designers don't have that visibility. And so if you can provide that level of transparency to them and make them feel a part of that decision-making process, and kind of bring them along with that journey, that's really successful. I feel like in kind of landing whatever objective is that you're trying to achieve. I think the notion of bringing people along is really, really key. Not everyone is going to see the full picture like you see as a product manager. And so bringing that to other people, I think, can be super beneficial.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess this answered the question, Augustine. So there's another question from Mikolash. So how many interviews had you gone through before getting your first PM job? And were there positions that you rejected?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I went through, actually, so my first PMI interview I took, it was the very first interview that I got that I did end up landing that job. So I didn't go through a ton of interviews before, but I did do upwards of like close to like 40 informationals, and basically didn't even get picked for those interviews. So I did a ton of informationals. I got kind of like what I would say is pre-rejected from even like the interview process, which kind of does happen, especially I think when you're interviewing internally, like I was like within Microsoft. So it definitely did get rejected a lot in that front. Once I landed an interview, I was actually fairly certain that if I took that role, like that was the job that I wanted to take. I had some kind of friends of friends who'd worked in that org, and I knew kind of some of the opportunities that were there. And I felt really good about kind of the growth that I would be able to have and kind of the ownership I'd be able to have in that specific role. Since then, like I've definitely, I think it's important, like just in general career, like to keep interviewing, keep finding new roles, and like always be doing that. I've definitely rejected roles since then for other product teams. And I think a big piece of that is kind of understanding the areas you want to grow as a product manager. For me, when I was initially looking at roles, I think the biggest thing that I wanted was like area of ownership, and ability to kind of like grow very quickly into like a more leadership kind of centric role on a team. And so with my last team in Azure networking, I like definitely had that capability. I was able to launch like my own service kind of end to end, oversee my own dev team. And that experience I felt like really helped me develop very quickly as a product manager. In this new role that I took over in Azure IoT Mobility, I kind of took this to kind of shift my focus. I wanted to really work more closely on mobility solutions. I'm super interested in urban planning and design. And so this was a really interesting mix of the kind of the industry I'd already worked in and the industry that I wanted to kind of see myself in more. And so this role was really focused on the industry switch. And so I think as you think about whether taking your first PM role or your second one, be super clear on kind of the reason you're doing it and the reason you're kind of looking to switch and pivot. Like I said, you can do a million different things in product, but understand what it is that you kind of want to do and what areas you're looking to grow or develop within those next 1 to 2 year timeline within that role.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have another question from YouTube. So Sam asks, how do you think the PM role has had to evolve as a result of remote work?
Definitely more communication focused, I think. I think sometimes it's easy to kind of in person, at least for me, I think it's easier to kind of like have presence in person and show up in person, whether you say something in a meeting or it's, not, like being there and having that physical presence in a room is definitely something I think I took for granted. Being remote, I think you have to focus a lot more on communicating in different avenues and re-communicating things. So whether that's having the meeting, then sending the email, and then sending that email again and again. I think like really over communicating some of those topics is really the best way to kind of continue bringing people along, and making sure the team feels very connected as a whole. It's definitely more effort, I think, sometimes than kind of the ad hoc conversations you can have either at the beginning of a meeting and end of a meeting in the hallway or things like that we could kind of more rely on when we were less remote.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering this one. So the next question is from Shalini. So as a non-tech PM, also acting as a PO, what are some strategies to be able to determine with your tech team how technical their work packages or tickets need to be.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. So what are some of the strategies to be able to determine with your tech team how technical their work packages or tickets need to be?
So I think a lot of that, I'll answer kind of broadly, but a lot of that depends on kind of like, I would say relying back on either your technical lead or the engineering lead, or if your company has like PM product manager, TPMs, technical product managers, working with some of those people. I think like you're definitely not alone as a PM. Like you have a team of people you're working with and you play a certain role, but those engineering managers or tech leads or PMTs also have like really important roles in kind of driving that overall strategy. And so I would say, I don't know if I have specific experience related to this question, but generally I would say when I'm in situations like that where I don't know what to do, relying back and asking questions to those other kind of core members of either my product team or kind of extended engineering team are definitely the best way to kind of break down and tackle those situations.
Okay, great. I hope this answered Shalini's question. So I see one recommendation on Zoom chat. Maybe it's helpful for people joining from YouTube as well. So I personally had a great time participating in the Swiss program Level Up by Product Academy for a certificate. And yeah, I see another question from Augustine. So what was your biggest challenge creating your portfolio when you were transitioning? Please, can you share some resources to create one?
I would say spend time looking at like a lot of product managers have their portfolio on their LinkedIn. So kind of scavenging some of that. Medium's a great one that people have kind of product solutions or product thing they defined. I spent a lot of time on that as well. Biggest challenge was probably just making the time for it and like being able to communicate what I was doing in a way that made sense to other audiences. I think sometimes like we get really internalized about what we're doing and have a very internal way of thinking about it, but thinking about how someone would view that from an external point of view can be difficult. The best thing I would recommend, honestly, is having people review it from different backgrounds. I had, engineering friends review it. I had designer friends review it. I had other PM friends review it, like really kind of circulating it just like you would a resume with your kind of broader network and asking for like feedback. Super helpful to kind of understanding how people thought about it. And that really helped me, I think, refine it over and over again. In terms of building one, I just used PowerPoint, or you could use Keynote, whatever it is, and publish it as a PDF. It's fairly simple to do it that way. I don't feel like you have to go crazy with like Adobe or anything like a website or anything like that. I think just kind of simple and to the point, and like being able to attach that with your resume goes a long way. And it doesn't have to be long either. Like I think I started mine initially. Now mine I've continued building it, but initially I think I only had like 3 like examples in there. And I think that can be, depending on your level of PM roles that you're trying to land, that can be sufficient. But I have really focused examples and too many examples.
Great, thank you. I now see question from Vaibhav. So that can be our last question, and then we can stop streaming and have little chat after this. So yeah, Vaibhav, do you want to ask the question verbally?
Yeah, I can. Hi, Megan. Once again, my question is, what were your initial challenges once you joined the PM role, and what's your source for tech news?
Oh, good questions. Source for tech news. Like I said, Stratechery is something that I read most mornings. I really like that. I'm also a big fan of just reading like I'm a big New York Times and Wall Street Journal reader. The tech sections there are great, but I actually tend to focus not only just on tech news, but like reading news at large. I think especially like working at Microsoft and other really big corporations, what's going on in the world at large has a lot to do with how we're launching things, the market we're launching things into. And so I do spend actually just a lot of time reading, I think, news that might be a little bit outside the day-to-day of kind of like what we do in tech. I think that's good to keep a fresh and more, not so much insular perspective too. In terms, I think to your first question of like my biggest challenges when I joined, I think realizing that like you kind of are a voice of authority or a leader without having any of the like official titles was kind of a unique change for me. I think I was used to kind of bubbling things up to my manager and having her communicate things out. And I realized really quickly, especially with my engineering teams, that like I was suddenly the voice of kind of reason and like needed to lead through those things without necessarily having the experience or thinking I had the experience. And so I think kind of projecting that confidence and like learning how to find the answers to things and say like, I don't know, but I will know tomorrow was one of those kind of motions that I had to get really used to. Something that was like, I think different than any other role that I'd been in, but it's something that I actually really enjoy about the role now, but definitely that kind of instant pressure and like, I think spotlight that you're sometimes put into can be a little bit of a wake up.
Thank you very much, Megan.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So I see a lot of thank yous and appreciation on YouTube as well as Zoom chat about the talk. It was a great talk, super helpful, very insightful. And yeah, so we'll be now stopping the stream. So those of you who are joining from YouTube or Facebook, they are welcome to join on Zoom so that we can have a little networking.
Yeah, I will stop the stream now. And yeah, thank you, Megan. We had around 50 people watching this session, and